Please join me in welcoming the 2013 inaugural class of Bellagio PopTech Fellows to the stage. Coming out. Hey guys, how are you? Lovely to see you. Right this way. I feel like the cruise director. That's right. Please find your seats. I wanted to spend just a minute or so getting all of you familiar with the folks. We had a really fantastic cohort of candidates for this program, and we were intentionally selective about how we brought this particular group of people together. So I'd like to ask each of you just to say a few words about where you come from, anchor you a little bit in the universe. We heard a little bit from some of you in the video, but let's start with you, Amy. Just a sense of what you do on a daily basis and what the sort of the big project goals are for your work.
Okay. So I'm a scientist, an activist, and a mother. And all of these come together in my work on climate change. I work on two aspects of climate change. One is public engagement, and the other is managing climate risks. And in public engagement, my work focuses on bringing the power of data analytics, social science, and experimentation into outreach campaigns and climate advocacy efforts. In the context of climate risk management, my focus is using new technologies to enhance access to information so that globally we can manage our resources more collectively, regionally, and enhance climate and water security in particular. So in my science and activist life work, I focus a lot on the quantified world, and I'm thrilled by the data that comes out of that because it allows us to understand the complex social, biological, biophysical systems and manage the risks of the crisis that is unfolding. However, as a mother, I watch as my child's life and culture is being shaped by digital tools and virtual spaces. And so I'm acutely aware of how, by digitizing our world, we're changing it. We're changing it in profound ways. And we're reshaping the sort of social, cultural, political forces that ultimately define how we will be able to manage, how well we'll be able to manage the climate crisis as it unfolds. So these are the issues I think about. I wanted to say one more thing, and that is, that what this always makes me constantly think about is that the decisions that we're making, not just about the emissions of greenhouse gases that we produce every day, but so many other decisions really are fundamentally shaping how vulnerable our children are to this climate crisis. And some of those decisions we're making mindfully, but a lot of them we're making mindlessly. And we really need to think about the trade-offs we make in those decisions.
Gustavo, let's hear a little bit about your work.
All right. I'm a journalist, and I've been working with environmental issues now for almost 10 years, spending most of my time writing about stories on climate change as well, and deforestation in the rainforests of South America. And right now, I'm coordinating a new initiative that we launched this year. It's called the Environmental News Innovation Lab, which is pretty much focused on creating applications, new tools, and projects to improve environmental coverage around the world, but mostly in developing countries. So recently, we launched a project with the Center of Investigative Journalists in South Africa to help them to track numbers of rhino poaching in national parks. So the work I was doing covering these issues led me to work with data. So I started working with forest fire data, deforestation data, and I realized that for dealing with these issues, which very often when you're reporting are very local, you're talking about a small farmer in the Amazon region doing slash and burning, but that has some kind of a global implication. Satellite data, for example, is very useful and very effective to tell this bigger story, like of the environmental change. So working with this data led me to create one project that I invite you to know. It's called infoamazonia.org, which is a platform which puts together different layers of data about mining concessions, oil concessions in the 9 countries of the Amazon, and creates this network of journalists writing stories in their local countries and combining what we try to do, the story that we're trying to create is this dialogue between the narratives on the ground and the data which comes from the satellites. So we're really trying to create contextual layers, and that's one of my main works nowadays as well. It's really pushing a kind of data journalism, which is we are calling geojournalism, because it's the capacity of telling a local story and creating this dialogue between a bigger context given by the satellite data. So,
Kate, you're a computer scientist. Talk to us about your work.
Well, I actually started out in the social sciences as a professor, and I have the extreme privilege of getting to work in two amazing interdisciplinary spaces. One is at MSR, where I get to work with theoretical physicists, with specialists in machine learning and information retrieval, with economists and anthropologists, and the other is at MIT at the Center for Civic Media, where I have extraordinary colleagues and truly just some of the most gifted students you can imagine. And several years ago, I started doing what I would call sort of large data studies of the way that people would communicate after a major disaster. So I was looking, first of all, at the huge floods we experienced in Queensland and Australia, and then at Hurricane Sandy. And I was really captured by the power and the potential of what you can do with enormous amounts of data. But I also started seeing a couple of problems emerge. And on one side, those problems are essentially epistemological, basically about how big data sees the world, that more data is better, and that somehow correlation is pretty much as good as causation. That started to worry me. And on the other side was ethics. How do we protect people who are represented in these data sets? There's some very sensitive data there that can be used to produce what's being called algorithmic discrimination. So my passion at the moment is thinking about how we might generate really strong data ethics. And in many ways, also think about due process, how we make sure that if people are discriminated against through the use of big data, they have some kind of recourse. So that's really driving my work at the moment.
Patrick, data has flowed throughout your work in digital humanitarianism. Do you want to talk about your background?
Yeah, sure, and this is a great follow-up. I'm glad we went in this order. So back at PopTech 2010, Josh Nesbitt and I gave a talk on the digital humanitarian response to the Haiti earthquake. And looking at it back now, I realize that this was really our first experience with big data, with big crisis data, because we were completely overwhelmed with the overflow of crisis information coming from Haiti in the form of news reports and social media, as well as text messages even. And I've since learned that this overflow of information during disasters can be as paralyzing to humanitarian response as the absence of information. And this is really one of the major challenges we face today in the humanitarian space. It's the needle in the haystack challenge, where the needle is actionable, life-saving information. And if there's no big data, there's no haystack. Finding the needle is probably easier. But with big data, you're faced with massive amounts of information, this great sort of stack of information during disasters, which makes finding informative content in real time particularly challenging, not to mention verifying this content in real time. So these are major challenges, but I think they're solvable with advanced computing and data science and ethics. And this is what we're doing at the Qatar Foundation with my team, is experimenting with machine learning and human computing to develop next generation humanitarian technologies so that we can all make better sense of this so-called big data during disasters and perhaps even save lives in the process.
Claudia Portlick is a computer scientist whose work explores the forefront of machine learning and its various many applications. Claudia, tell us a little bit about what you do.
So as I started saying in the video, it must have been maybe 15 years ago when I was just some kind of a strange geek who got completely fascinated with playing around with data and digging around. It's like a detective game, and you're trying to figure out what secrets it's hiding and what you can find there. And 12 years later, now people call it the sexiest job. From what I've seen here on the stage over the last 2 days, I'm sure there's a lot more sexy stuff to do than what I do. But that being said, So my background is in machine learning, and I went and spent some time at IBM Research working on all kinds of problems, from analyzing Twitter feeds over breast cancer data. So I'm not very particular about what the data is, as long as you let me just go and have fun with it and try to figure out what's in there. Since then, I now am chief scientist of a startup in the city that does display advertising, which I find a fun playground to just learn what works and what doesn't. I think this is the real segue in where I see my role, or my main role today. I'm kind of observing what's going on in the general culture, how people perceive big data and how it's talked about. And I think I would love to be a voice of reason and the facilitator to help people who really need to make big data useful, but can't quite cut through the hype of what's being said. So I want to bring people together who really have the skill set that you need to have today, and those who have really interesting problems that can help to shape the world. And I would like to invite all of you to talk to me, come and catch up with me, and I'd love to be part of whatever interesting thing you're doing with data.
Rounding out this sextet is Jer Thorpe, who brings a data artist's eye to this conversation. Jerry, you want to?
Thanks, yeah. I feel like I know a lot of people in the room from last year and from karaoke last night, but thankfully I can't see any of you, so I'll treat you all as strangers. I've been thinking around data for about 5 years, and over the last year, I think a lot of people have asked the same question, which is like, what is this big data thing, and what does it really mean? And for me, over the last maybe week or so, I've really been thinking about the idea that this technology has breached its containment fields. It was at one time contained within science and within business, but it's leaked out and contaminated all of us. We are all in contact with this thing every day, and it's changing us, and we're changing it. And where I'm most excited about and most interested about is this kind of many-folded boundary between culture and data, and what's happening. It's as I said, it's kind of this two-way field. So as a visual artist, I'm really interested in producing systems that will help us understand that. I run a studio in New York City called the Office for Creative Research, and we think around a lot of these issues from all kinds of angles. We do some work with companies that are trying to think about how they can embrace concepts like data ownership and how they can understand their own data in a way that respects the users who are producing that data. And on the other side, we do a fair amount of work with museums and galleries. We are really privileged to be artists in residence at the Museum of Modern Art this year, where we're working on a public program that'll help people engage with the data that the museum collects around all of their pieces, because like all of these things, data is changing the way that we experience art, and art is hopefully changing the way we experience data.
Now, one of the things that we're going to continue to have this conversation. We're going to explore many different issues in the session. But one of the things that I think is intriguing about this particular program and this approach to convening fellows is that the goal here from the beginning was always that we would encourage you to explore the possibility of joint expression, and that the wonderful, and I think from the parts that I saw, just extraordinarily rich conversations that you've had, might produce something that could impact the world beyond the narrow field of an individual context. And Jared, do you want to talk a little bit about how that?
I would love to, but I need the clicker.
All right, so we're going to do an experiment.
It's a clicker required.
There you go. Collaboration at work in front of you.
Yeah, it's a low-pressure environment to present a brand new paper with your 5 co-authors watching. So our conversations at Bellagio, as you can imagine from our backgrounds, were quite wide-ranging, and I think it took us a little bit of time to settle into the territory that we were most interested in. And I think we all agreed quite quickly that one of the focuses of our conversation would not be about sort of broad level resilience, but about community resilience. And when we say that, like how can resilience be fostered by the communities themselves instead of something that is kind of poured on top of it from some type of outside source? So we started thinking about community resilience, and we started to think about data, and where we got to was we got to this idea that we could produce a kind of framework for people to think around these issues. And geometry helped us a little bit here, and we ended up with this idea of what we call the hexagon. And the hexagon has 6 things attached to it. And here what we're trying to suggest is that for thinking to be effective around community resilience and data, we think that people should be considering 6 different things. And if you look at the thinking that you're doing and you can see some weak areas, maybe those are places that you need to bolster. So it acts as a mechanism to strengthen thinking, but also as kind of a way to maybe start some new ideas. So let me walk you around the hexagon really quickly, and then we'll get into a broader conversation. So at the very top of the hexagon, on purpose at the top of the hexagon, we kind of look at it as our kind of guiding point of this shape is ethics. And this is something that a lot of us in this group have been thinking and talking about, that a lot of the dialogue around data has really not considered what effects are these technologies and these acts of measurement happening on the people who are being measured. And so in this domain, we talk about things like rights and fairness and agency, and really trying to encourage people to have a clear set of guidelines before they undertake action that involves data. The next piece of the puzzle is governance. This combines both public policy and private policy. This is maybe something that has become a lot clearer over the last few months with the news about the NSA and the leaks from Snowden and so on, that the government as well as corporations have a lot of policy pieces that are going to affect the way that these things are affecting communities and therefore affecting the resilience of those communities. Science. We have this new phrase called data science. I think what we're trying to do here is to maybe uncouple that and bring it back to science, and developing good hypotheses, being critical, all of these things that are embedded in capital S science that I think in some cases have been left behind, and also the ability to predict well using scientific methods and all kinds of things that are related to that. Technology was the number one thing we talk about when we talk about big data, and we don't want to reduce its role by just making it one of 6, but we do want to kind of place it on its own and think about what are the types of technologies, predictive technologies, and so on that are built in with what we would call data science, and how we can be critical and careful when we're applying those things, but also some of the opportunity that exists within technology. We put a focus in our document on open source technology and using open source technologies, not just because it's a feel-good thing to do, but because we think it actually bolsters resilience. By using technology that's uncoupled from large corporations, it means you're uncoupling it from the policy side of that thing, but you're also making sure that your software platforms are going to last longer, and so on and so on. The second last one is place. And an easy way of saying this is that a project that works somewhere may very well not work somewhere else. A project that works somewhere and is helpful somewhere may be in fact destructive somewhere else. So when we're developing these types of strategies, it's really important to consider the place. And by that we mean the natural environment and the built environment, but also things like the climate, neighborhoods, cities, so on and so on and so on. And then finally, this idea of socio-cultural context. So this is the types of behaviors that are inherent to a culture, but also these things that we would broadly call cultural activities. So arts, media, journalism that can really help bolster and strengthen these systems. I'm swinging back to ethics at the end because really this is the focus of our document. We've been using the term ethical resilience to think about how can we try to bolster resilience, but not taking steps that go so far that they remove the individual rights of the people who are involved. So I think I'm going to leave this slide up for our conversation. We might use it as a touch point as we move forward, but I'll just end in saying that this white paper is now available for download. There will be a slide up that will have the link. It's been posted to the PopTech site. It's been posted, I think, to the PopTech Twitter as well. All of us will be madly tweeting it away. And as a white paper, the purpose of it is to try to get as many people into this conversation as we can. So please read the white paper. Tell us where we were wrong. Also tell us where we were right, because we like that. But maybe more importantly, add your voice to the conversation, because this is something that I think is really important, and we would love to have all of your collective brains in the discussion.
That's great. And as we said, it's going out, and it's going to, I think, continue to evolve. And that feedback loop, I think, is really important as we take the conversation forward. I'm going to bounce around and ask these guys some questions and elaborate. If you have questions and want to ask things of the panel, the way we're going to handle this is please email them in to questions@poptech.org, and there's a way for us to see them as they come in and pick a few out if that's valuable to you, or tweet them, and we'll be paying attention as we go. I want to start with Patrick, actually. I'm gonna bounce around, but Patrick, one of the questions you raised during the workshop was resilience for whom? Can you explore that a little bit?
Sure, yeah, that's a question that came back in and out, because it's very easy when we're talking about big data and data science and technology. You start no longer thinking about resilience perhaps as a political issue or a community-based issue, but as a technical issue, where you need to try and optimize the equations and get the data. And the communities only serve your purpose for extracting information from the communities, but that process does not make them more resilient. So it was interesting. We'd go back and forth. It was like a pendulum. We'd get into the data science, think about the technology, and realize, wait a minute, that completely crowds out local communities themselves. So it's not only about ethical resilience, but it's really about people-centered ethical resilience. So it was really interesting just going back and forth during the whole workshop.
In that context, Patrick, do the communities today that, I know this is an overly broad question, but in the communities that you work with, do you find that the right kinds of literacies are there? Are the right kinds of competencies there to make that a meaningful exercise? And if not, what do we need to do to encourage them?
So that's a great question. I think another speaker earlier today sort of got at this as well. It's not about us trying to change them so we can work with other communities and learn from them. It's about us matching our tools and our approaches to meet the needs and the way that others communicate. So obviously, literacy, period, is an issue in many areas where disasters strike. So how do you deal with that? Do you go with voice-based solutions and so on? So that's something we always have to keep in mind. And that goes back to what Kate said as well, is we talk about big data and its exclusions. Who are we excluding from big data? And ultimately, the most marginalized and the most off the charts, off the grid, are the most vulnerable. And if we're not developing platforms and creating an interface to interact with these communities, learn, and provide an information service, then what are we doing? We're wasting our time, I think.
I want to continue that thread, actually, by asking you, Kate, a question about another theme of the conversation, another phrase. You talked about power relationships. Actually, we just heard it a little bit in our setup. But I want to ask you about data feudalism and this idea that if information is power and absolute power corrupts absolutely, absolute information may be an amplifier thereof. So do you want to talk a little bit about how does this conversation sit within this larger set of issues?
Well, it's a great point. We love this term, data feudalism.
Lord Zuckerberg.
Exactly, Lord Zuckerberg. It's really interesting. We discovered that...
We're all tilling Farmville plots. Sorry.
Exactly.
Tenant farmers.
Basically, we realized we're living in an enormous social experiment right now. So what happened, just a couple of months ago is that AT&T and Verizon have both decided to start selling off their customer data sets. So that's your location, that's your browsing history, that's now available for sale. Your Fitbit is probably recording when you sleep and when you exercise. And then we have all of these technologies like Twitter and Facebook that give profound insights into what you're thinking and what you're doing. This is an enormous experiment, bringing all of this technology together. And a lot of that is is being done in ways that we have no visibility into. It's completely opaque. So there's a serious power imbalance that's occurring, and that's particularly happening in terms of the collection of data sets. So in an experiment like this, what's so interesting is that it has no ethics process. It has no opt-out. We're actually going to live through this and try and figure it out as we go. That's sort of really profound social exercise that we're sharing in. So part of what we're thinking about is, okay, how do we protect vulnerable populations? How do we think about those dynamics and changes so that those power imbalances aren't so extreme as they are now? I'm pretty optimistic there are ways we can address that. Some of those solutions will be legal and social, some will be technical. But having that discussion, having these sorts of people together in a space to say, okay, how are we going to deal with this? And that's basically what I hope this document does. I mean, I've had some great conversations with people in this room from places like the New York Times R&D Lab, from people at a range of universities who are saying, yeah, we need to improve data science by thinking about people and thinking about ethics. So that's happening.
Let me come over to Claudia on that point about, as a data scientist, Claudia, you know, a few weeks ago, I found out that a big data broker called Axiom made it possible for you to dig in and actually find out what they knew about you. So I was terrified, you know, being a man with a browser history, what they could possibly have known about me. And then I logged in and found out that the first thing they knew about me was that my name was Andrea. So in many ways, I actually don't envy your job as a data scientist, as superpowered a position as that is. That you have to. It seems like, you know, we're living in this era of big data, and we're also living through this era of even bigger misinformation. They got my bra size wrong. I mean, come on.
But you had to give them your social security number.
Right,
Did you notice that? You had to
That's
give
the
them
much
your social
interesting
security
part.
number.
I had to tell them my name was Andrew for them to tell me my name was Andrew.
Yeah.
It's bizarre. So how do you deal with that? Tell us about how that works. Like how do these tools actually play out in the like give us a sense of the reality of data science today. Its promises and maybe its overpromises.
So I think that's a great example, and one of kind of my negative cases typically why I'm somewhat hesitant on what people expect. There is this notion of we can now know everything, but the reality is you know a lot, but most of it is wrong, or it's not what you think it actually means. But stepping back to my job, I would love to change the discussion, not the broader discussion we're having, but every time somebody actually has data, wants to do something, it's like, I don't want to know what data you have. That's not where you start the conversation. You need to first think about what you want to do. What do you want to achieve? What actions can or can't you take? And before we have come to some clarity on this, the data is just this huge beast that threatens to just swallow you whole and you will never find your way out of it. The only way to embark on dealing with the new world of big data, which actually I think is not that new, it's just that more people who didn't know the old world think about it. But the only way to really have a direction and come to a place where data becomes useful and you can find the needles in Patrick's haystack is if you have a very clear compass to start with. What's the decision that's driven by ethics and all the other things? And from there, the beauty of my world is that I work with machines and algorithms, and guess what? They don't even know what names are. It's just some arbitrary combination of letters which are saved in ASCII that just has 0 and 1. So for the machine, none of this actually matters. And on that level, the notion of meaning completely goes away. So I, as a human interact, I still have to facilitate the backward translation, and it starts initially by having a notion where you want to go. Just collecting everything. Well, you can do it today, you can do it cheaply, and on some level I love it, but it's not going to solve any of your problems. It will just create a lot more of them. And
what strikes me about that is what Emily Jacobi, a social innovation fellow, said yesterday. She starts with a question, what world do you want to live in?
Yeah.
Who gets to decide, and what role will you play? And we have to start with that, not the data. right? Because then you verge into unethical resilience and you maximize the equations and there's total surveillance society. So I like that a lot.
So I want to, just picking up on that very thread of the social utility of information and how we make it valuable. You know, Amy, you talked at the very outset of that the climate community is actually replete with lots of data. And there's a wonderful statistic I think that IBM came up with, that 90% of all of the data currently available to humanity since the dawn of record keeping in digital form was invented in the last 2 years. So that's more a byproduct, I think, of the fact that we're generating more and more necessarily than that we have a complete ahistoricism, though we may. But the question I want to ask you is, as someone who's thinking about moving the action framework forward, does more information help or does it hinder? Because it seems to be that it's actually disaggregated in some ways from the debates. The debates over climate change are influenced by information but not determined by information. Otherwise, the conversation would be in a different place today. So how do you think about these issues?
Great question. I mean, I think that more science isn't going to change this debate. And you know, more science is always going to be incremental and more nuanced, and you know, in some ways, is probably going to make the discussion more challenging as we move forward. However, the information is critical for managing the risks of climate change, and you know, we've spent a lot of time talking about big data in terms of what is tracked in terms of our search queries and our phone and Twitter feeds and so forth. But big data also is involved in longer term perspectives when you think about climate change. And one of the critical things, because climate change is going to be with us for a long time, and we're conducting a biophysical experiment. Kate mentioned a social experiment. And as we conduct that biophysical experiment, we need to understand what's happening. And to understand what's happening, the flow of data that comes out of, you know, the digitization of our world in terms of tracking weather, but also tracking feedbacks from the implications of a warming world is critical for understanding long-term trends, understanding sources of resilience, as well as vulnerabilities and thresholds. So the short term can help for feedbacks and response on the climate system, but the long term is really critical for understanding where we're headed.
So what that points out to me is the gap between having the right information and the right scale of information and the right mechanisms to produce it in a way that balances inclusivity and respect for underlying rights to privacy and the kinds of things that you talk about in the ethical frame. And that enormous gap between producing information, that kind of wonderful, beneficial kinds of information, and our gap in being able to understand what to do about it and how to act upon it and how to move that forward. So I want to turn to you, Gustavo. You're in that world, and one of those mechanisms of thinking about both the relationship between data and journalism and media in general, which is in many ways one of the primary sensor distribution networks we have for what to do about the world when we read about it on the web or on the papers.
Yeah, I think when I was listening to Kate and Amy, I was thinking about one of the discussions we had very often in Bellagio was around narratives. And that was, of course, very appealing to me because I deal with this. But as we are in the middle of this experiment, as you said, we are also shaping the narrative. And for me, being there in the middle of the discussion, which is really surprising to me because I come from this background of being a data journalist, so data is great. I mean, it just helps to do my work. But then I realized that actually can be the narrative around if it's good or bad or how it works is being shaping as well. It's being shaped now. So I think the role that we're going to play on shaping this narrative, how this experiments is going to end up both on the physical world and the social world is going to be key. And one of the main concerns also that I think we had there was this tension between the local and the global. Because when we were talking now about collecting data, we were talking about like our phones or sensors acting as sensors, or like sensors around the cities. That's a whole new conference maybe we can create here just to discuss sensors and the ethics behind collecting data in the cities. But we kind of looking a lot on the hyperlocal data. And again, as a journalist, you start thinking, so if we're just concerned about our hyperlocal data, what's the role of creating a narrative about the problems in Syria or climate change? So how this, not having this global perspective, although we all know how we are interlinked, affect community resilience. So if I'm talking about the community in the Amazon, that their resilience is clearly linked with the meat market of Europe, because they're pushing like land grab and other things around that region. So this tension between local and global data is really important, I think.
Absolutely.
Jerry, I want to come to you because this question of, so that leads to another interesting point. So you're trying to produce the right information with the right kinds of lenses and constraints so that you cover I think some irresolvable tensions, I think, between privacy, inclusivity, value, actionability, all of these other things, in a way that overcomes perhaps a cognitive gap and connects us to meaningful action, connects us to what to do when we actually sense these kinds of signals. And that, how to make things usable, useful, actionable is a design brief. And so as someone who thinks about the aesthetics and actionability and interfaces, do you want to talk about the role of design there?
Well, I mean, I think actionable is an interesting term to use, but I think people are trying to find ways to make decisions based on data right now, and I think we can couple that with another requirement, which is like how to use data to make better questions, and so. I always break down, I do a lot of data visualization, and in data visualization I break it down into two purposes. We have like this reductive form of data visualization, which is about taking something complicated and making it more simple, which is really important in a lot of these realms. But there's also a second piece of it, which is this revelatory purpose. Let's show us things that we may have not seen before. To me, as a designer, I think we need to make sure that our focus is on both of those things, because we're not really at the point right now where all we need to do is make decisions. We also need to learn a lot more about what's happening to sort of keep those two avenues open is very, very, very important for me. Now, I think design plays an incredibly big role in this process. But it can also be a really dangerous instrument, as we've probably seen. The data I could produce a data visualization on any side of any topic and probably convince you that one of those two sides are correct. So,
what resonates for me in the through line of all of these different considerations around these questions of data, and it goes back to your collective Hexagon, is that if you think about the roles that are implicit in that hexagon, right? Governance structures and social cultural context. And by the way, let's bring the URL up for folks. If you want to download the collective work of the fellows, first big collective expression of the fellows. But that hexagon is about solving ethical concerns, but it seems to be as much about building a whole social system around data. That if you're going to do this in communities, you've got to actually talk to the people in charge and the people on the street and the people who have institutions and the technologists who are going to produce the sensors. There's actually a huge coordination task around the sort of an ecosystem around what you're trying to do. Any of you want to take that?
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's the enormous challenge that we're facing, and precisely Amy's point about this need for data about the long term. We need to have data that looks at not just 50 years, but 500 years out, what's going to be happening to these kinds of systems? But there's a confusion that happens when we try to think about the data collection in natural systems with human systems. We introduce a whole lot of new risks and vulnerabilities when we do massive human data collection. So disarticulating those and then thinking about it on the ground, how you get people involved so they can participate in how we design data systems, I think that's one of the key issues we're facing, which is actually why we'd like to invite everybody here. If you've got time tomorrow for breakfast, we're going to be gathering around the corner at the coffee shop, and we would love to actually have this conversation with you, particularly if you're working on these kinds of issues in communities, because we think that's exactly in these sorts of spaces where we can have these conversations and we can move the debate forward.
Amy.
So can I just add to that? We had a presentation yesterday on citizen science, and there is a really important movement in engaging people in science to get people more involved in climate and conservation issues. And I think that there's a parallel here, providing people a pathway for being involved in the understanding the implications and addressing the challenges that the collection of data can provide can make us all better stewards of the earth and of our societies.
It's about being mindful.
It's about being mindful, exactly.
Yeah, it all comes
together.
That's right. I have one last question for all of you, and that is, can you give us a negative lesson? That is to say, as much as we're talking about what needs to happen, can we talk about what needs to not happen? That is to say, give us an example of something that is sort of pushes us to the right place but keeps us out of the wrong places. Do you want to talk? Patrick, why don't you?
So bad things, I can talk a little about.
Patrick doesn't do negative.
Actually, a topic that we all discussed during the time in Bellagio was that trust is important for resilience, social bonds and so on. And this surveillance state that we live in kind of breaks a lot of that trust, right? The kernel, at least in the humanitarian space, of data privacy and data protection is informed consent. How many times do we realize, by accident sometimes, that, oh wow, so I'm using my flashlight on my app, just like the presentation yesterday, and somebody's actually pulling location information, and just flagrant sort of violation of basic privacy, human rights, and all that stuff. And I think that's a very dangerous space. And I think one of the most interesting, though, themes to come out of Bellagio was I didn't expect that we would necessarily go to that. I think we would go about, let's see what role we can play, rather than what society we want to live in, and that got flipped, and that was very important. I'm just paranoid, I guess, about this whole data privacy. That's just there's no data privacy, and that's a problem for resilience in local communities.
Jer, and then Claudia?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick with this. The New York Times published this story about 3 weeks ago that a researcher, capital R ambiguous researcher, had discovered the saddest location in New York City. It was a school called Hunter College, and Hunter College aggregated meetings. Lots of parents were interested in this. The students had large discussion around what was happening. A journalist finally went back to the researcher and asked him to dig back into the data, and it turned out it was completely false. Completely false. He'd made a mistake. He was using a very small data set. But the romanticism of big data allows us to publish a headline like that, which was only mildly destructive on a community, but could have been much more destructive on a community. And so we have to be very careful with bad science. And that study was like just a perfect example of really bad science, that somehow we love to talk about these things. We love to say a sentiment analysis study proved this thing, but we forget that this is about humans. And anytime you're bringing humans into the realm, we have to be careful, and we can't just fall to the allure of this technology.
It's interesting on that very point that, the very term data science, at some point we decided people were going to be scientists who were working with data, as opposed to other artists or fill in the blank. And the interesting thing about that is that I think in some senses it works in as much as it involves math that people can't do, and it can be done by scientists, ergo scientists. But on the other hand, it also suggests that information that is quantified is true. That is to say, the data doesn't lie. Hey, the data doesn't lie.
I think this is one of the biggest dangers, and it relates exactly to your story and also a little bit to your point of using visualization to communicate insights, but to look at data to find them. Always really hesitant on the latter, because it's not that the data lies, it's just as a recording of something. It's just that your interpretation, what it means, doesn't correspond with what it actually was that you were down there. And I think the bigger topic that I find very hard to communicate is, most people feel that data is like a technical domain, but quality control in data is just awful. It's really, really hard. I don't know how good my model is, and I don't know if I spent another week on it, whether I will be getting 1% or 10% better. I have no idea, and I'm presumably good at what I do. I think the big issue with data science is exactly that. You never know whether it is any good and how you keep it going. It has a very kind of subjective component and skill that needs to maintain to address exactly these kinds of problems then popping up.
It's so true. There's this lovely quote actually by Jeff Bowker, which is one of my all-time favorites, where he says that raw data is both an oxymoron and a bad idea. And that, on the contrary, data should be cooked with care. And I think it's by working with people like Claudia that you can see just how much is done at the human level, that we sort of fetishize algorithms and data. But actually what it really gets down to is getting better as scientists at really trying to use these kinds of, I mean, the sentiment study was classic. It was a problem of geolocation. The dot on the map was slightly north of the school.
And a tiny sample size, and bad journalism.
Exactly.
Like,
That's a classic.
Sorry.
I think it's a topic that Gustavo can talk about. Everybody published this study without doing the smallest amount of interrogation.
That's right.
Yeah, there's a lot to be done in terms of data literacy. We haven't talked about that, but for journalists, it should be maybe a class in the university nowadays. Because we are talking about data journalism is also almost like a pleonasm. We always have been working with data, but we need more literacy now around tools and this kind of things. No?
So that gets to, going back to something that Andrew said, that data scientists, it's okay that it's scientists because it's math and other people can't do it or something. I actually think one of the challenges is that I think almost everybody can be a data scientist. No, Claudia. But I mean, I think that there is more of a perception that everybody can be a data scientist than a climate scientist, for example. And the challenge, I think there's sort of good things and bad things about that. One of the challenges is, as going back to the citizen science piece, as we get more and more access to satellite imagery, and this is something that Gustavo engages with as well, we can open up more collective stewardship of our resources. But there's this challenge there, right? There is a scientific process with science with a big S, which does have peer review, that does give us a sense of what do we believe as best as we can to be true based on our hypothesis testing. And then there's this mass assessment of our analysis of the data that's out there, looking for patterns. Now, I think there's something that can be gleaned from that, but the challenge is you could have headlines saying, whatever's happened to the deforestation is assessed this way because I made this map and I, am a data scientist and know nothing about what kind of trees are out there or whatever, but I can make this map. And you can imagine a shift in what is published, which is not expert-driven, but it's populist-driven, about describing what's happening on the Earth. And I sort of feel a tension there, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for engaging the public on this, but there are a lot of challenges that could guide us and misguide us in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, just to close, on Jer's anecdote, that question of what's the saddest place in New York might be the wrong question, because the saddest place in New York isn't a place that we can get to, or that they just geographically got it wrong and it's Anthony Weiner's house. So, and with that, please join me in thanking and meeting all of you. Thank you again. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Good pleasure. Thanks, guys.